Man leaves a crippled horse tied up in the forest to die, but what happens next is incredible. The thundering of hooves against the packed dirt track was a symphony Solano had known since his earliest days. The morning sun cast long shadows across the racing grounds as he prepared for what would be his final race, though he couldn't have known it then. His muscular frame rippled with anticipation, each breath measured and controlled, just as he'd been trained. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching from. Stay with us. The stands were filling quickly, a sea of faces both familiar and strange. Among them sat Maxwell Richardson, Solano's owner, his cold eyes fixed on the track with calculated interest. To him, each horse was an investment, a figure in his ledger, nothing more. But Solano had been different, a champion who had brought him unprecedented success and acclaim in the racing circuit. "He's still our best shot at the Golden Cup," one of the stable hands whispered to another as they prepared Solano for the race. "Never seen a horse with such heart." Indeed, Solano's reputation preceded him. 5 years of victories had earned him the nickname the Unstoppable, and his presence at any race automatically made him the favorite. The morning papers had run their usual predictions. Solano set to dominate again. The pressure of expectations sat heavily in the air. But Solano had never known anything else. The preparation ritual was familiar, the gentle brush strokes against his coat, the careful fitting of the saddle, the whispered encouragements from his jockey, Michael. Unlike Maxwell, Michael understood Solano. Their partnership had been forged through countless early morning training sessions, victories and quiet moments when the stables were empty of all but the most dedicated. "Ready for another win, old friend?" Michael patted Solano's neck, receiving a gentle nuzzle in response. Their bond was evident to anyone who cared to look, though Maxwell dismissed such sentiments as unnecessary softness. The call to positions rang out across the track. Solano's ears perked forward, his body tensing with practiced readiness. As they made their way to the starting gate, the crowd's excitement was palpable. The other horses seemed to sense it too, their nervous energy manifesting in pawing hooves and tossing heads. The starting gate closed behind them with a metallic clang. Solano's world narrowed to the track ahead, his breathing steady, his muscles coiled like springs. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-dampened grass and the earthiness of the track. Everything was perfect, just as it had been countless times before. The starter's gun cracked through the air, and the gates flew open. Solano burst forward with the explosive power that had become his trademark. The familiar rhythm of the race took hold, the thundering of hooves, the wind rushing past, the strategic positioning among the other horses. Michael's guidance was subtle, almost telepathic, born from years of trust and shared victories. They took the first turn with practiced precision, maintaining their position near the front of the pack. The crowd's roar became a distant hum as Solano focused on the task at hand. This was his element where he truly belonged. The second turn approached, and Michael gave the signal to make their move. Solano responded instantly, finding that extra gear that had made him legendary. They began to pull ahead, just as they had done so many times before. The finish line beckoned, promising another triumph to add to their impressive record. The crowd rose to their feet, anticipating yet another spectacular victory from their champion. But fate had other plans. As they rounded the final turn, something changed. A slight misstep, a moment of hesitation, imperceptible to most, but to Solano and Michael, it was like a thunderclap. The smooth rhythm that had carried them to countless victories suddenly faltered. Solano's left hind leg, which had been giving him slight trouble in recent training sessions, seized up mid-stride. The world seemed to slow down as Solano fought to maintain his balance. Michael, sensing the change immediately, tried to adjust, but the momentum was too great. The other horses began to close the gap, their hooves throwing up clouds of dust as they thundered past. For the first time in his racing career, Solano wasn't leading the pack as they approached the finish line. The aftermath of that fateful race transformed Solano's world overnight. The veterinarian's diagnosis was swift and merciless, a severe tendon injury that would never fully heal. The whispers in the stable changed from admiration to pity, and Maxwell Richardson's disappointment manifested in cold silence and avoiding glances. Michael stood by Solano's stall late into the night, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck. "We had a good run, didn't we?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The best there ever was." Solano pressed his muzzle against Michael's shoulder, sensing his friend's distress. The stable was quiet except for the occasional rustle of hay and the soft nickering of other horses. But Michael's loyalty couldn't change the harsh reality of the racing world. Maxwell Richardson was a businessman first and foremost, and an injured champion was nothing more than a liability. The decision came swiftly, delivered in clipped tones during a morning meeting with the stable manager. "He's useless now," Maxwell declared, his voice devoid of any sentiment for the horse that had earned him millions. "Can't race, can't breed. There's no point in keeping him. Make the arrangements." The stable manager nodded silently, knowing better than to argue with Maxwell's decisions. The news spread through the stable like wildfire. The grooms who had cared for Solano, the exercise riders who had trained with him, and even the other stable hands who had admired him from afar, all were shocked by the coldness of the decision. But none were more devastated than Michael. "You can't do this," Michael confronted Maxwell in the stable yard, his voice rising with emotion. "Solano's earned the right to retire with dignity. He's made you more money than any other horse you've ever owned." Maxwell's response was ice cold. "Sentiment has no place in this business, Michael. You should know that by now. The decision is final." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Michael standing alone in the dusty yard. That night, Michael spent hours with Solano, reminiscing about their victories together. He brought extra carrots and apples, trying to make their last moments together special. "I wish I could save you, old friend," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I wish I could do something." But Michael's presence was notably absent the next morning when two unfamiliar men arrived at the stable before dawn. They brought an old truck with a trailer attached, its paint peeling and its metal rusted in places. The stable hands watched in silence as Solano was loaded into the trailer, his proud head hanging low as if he sensed what was to come. The truck's engine roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness, and the vehicle began its journey away from the only home Solano had ever known. Through the slats in the trailer, he caught glimpses of the familiar training tracks fading into the distance. The smooth pavement eventually gave way to rough dirt roads, each bump and jolt a reminder of how far he was traveling from his former life. The journey seemed endless, the landscape changing from the manicured grounds of the racing stable to increasingly wild and untamed territory. The air grew thicker with the scent of pine and wild vegetation, so different from the clean, hay-scented air of his stable. Solano's injured leg ached with each bump and turn, but there was nowhere to find comfort in the confined space of the trailer. Finally, the truck came to a stop in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The forest loomed dark and mysterious on all sides, a world entirely alien to a horse who had spent his life between pristine stable walls and carefully maintained racetracks. The men emerged from the truck, their boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. One of them, a weathered man with calloused hands, pulled Solano from the trailer with rough efficiency. There was no gentleness in his touch, no word of comfort or reassurance. This was simply a job to be done, an unwanted animal to be disposed of. The other man carried a length of rope, its rough fibers a far cry from the soft leather leads Solano was accustomed to. The men worked quickly, securing Solano to a massive oak tree with practiced movements. The rope was pulled tight around his neck, the knot complex and secure. Neither man spared a glance back as they returned to their truck, their footsteps fading into the sound of the engine starting. The forest enveloped Solano in an unfamiliar silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through leaves and distant bird calls. The comfortable rhythms of stable life, the morning feed, the training sessions, the evening grooming, seemed like memories from another lifetime. Here, in this vast expanse of wilderness, time moved differently. As the day progressed, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The rope around his neck was tight and unyielding, its rough fibers chafing against his skin with every movement. The ground beneath his hooves was soft and unfamiliar, nothing like the packed dirt of the racetrack or the clean straw of his stall. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, making his ears twitch nervously. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. Solano's throat burned with thirst, and his stomach cramped with hunger. The sweet hay and carefully measured grain that had fueled his racing career were nowhere to be found. Instead, the forest taunted him with the sight of grass and leaves just beyond his reach. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, threatening growl that grew steadily closer. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of approaching rain. Solano's racing instincts urged him to seek shelter, but the rope held firm, keeping him exposed to the elements. The first drops fell like scattered shots, quickly building into a heavy downpour that soaked through his coat. The storm's intensity increased, transforming the peaceful forest into a chaos of whipping branches and howling wind. Rain streamed down Solano's face, and his injured leg trembled with the effort of standing on the increasingly muddy ground. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in brief, brilliant flashes that made shadows dance between the trees. It was during one particularly violent gust of wind that fate intervened. The rope, now wet and straining against the rough bark of the tree, began to weaken. Solano felt the slight give in the restraint, a tiny loosening that sparked a glimmer of hope. His survival instinct, honed through years of competitive racing, kicked in. He began to work against the rope systematically, timing his movements with the swaying of the branches. The storm raged on, but Solano's focus never wavered. Each pull against the rope was calculated, each shift of his weight deliberate. The rain had softened the fibers, and the constant friction against the tree bark was slowly working in his favor. With one particularly strong gust of wind, he felt the rope give way slightly more. Through the night, Solano continued his patient struggle. His racing days had taught him the value of endurance, of pushing through exhaustion when every muscle screamed for rest. This was a different kind of race now, not for glory or prizes, but for survival itself. The darkness pressed in around him, but his determination never faltered. Finally, as the storm reached its peak, there was a sudden snap. The rope, weakened by rain and persistence, broke free from the tree. Solano stumbled forward, momentarily disoriented by his newfound freedom. The length of rope still dangled from his neck, but he was no longer bound to the spot that was meant to be his final resting place. The rain began to ease, though water still dripped steadily from the leaves above. Solano took his first tentative steps into the forest, his injured leg protesting with each movement. The world around him was vast and unknown, full of sounds and scents he had never encountered in his sheltered life at the racing stable. His initial instinct was to search for familiar territory, but the forest offered no clear path. Every direction looked the same, an endless sea of trees and undergrowth. The comfortable boundaries of track and stable were gone, replaced by the limitless expanse of wilderness. He was free, but freedom brought its own challenges. As dawn approached, casting a pale light through the wet leaves, Solano began to move deeper into the forest. His stomach gnawed with hunger, and his throat was parched, despite the recent rain. Years of having food and water provided had left him ill-equipped for finding sustenance on his own. The lush grass that grew between the trees looked inviting, but was it safe? The clear puddles left by the storm promised relief from his thirst. But where were the best places to drink? Each step was a lesson in his new reality. The soft forest floor was nothing like the firm track he was used to, and his injured leg required careful navigation of the uneven terrain. But with each passing hour, his movements became more confident. The rope that still hung from his neck served as a constant reminder of what he had escaped, driving him forward into the unknown. The days that followed tested every fiber of Solano's being. His once gleaming coat had lost its luster, dulled by dirt and scratched by branches. The remnants of the rope still hung from his neck, a constant reminder of his former life. He had learned through trial and error which plants were edible and which water sources were safe, but survival was a daily challenge. His injured leg, though still weak, had begun to adapt to the forest terrain. The constant movement, while painful, had forced him to develop new ways of walking, of distributing his weight. It wasn't the powerful stride that had won him races, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. The sound of running water drew him deeper into the forest one morning. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows through the misty air. As he approached the source of the sound, the trees opened up to reveal a crystal-clear stream, its waters dancing over smooth stones. The sight of clean, flowing water was irresistible after days of drinking from stagnant puddles. Solano lowered his head to drink, savoring the cool freshness of the stream. His ears suddenly pricked forward. There was something different about the forest sounds this morning. The usual chorus of birds had fallen silent. The air carried new scents, familiar yet wild, setting his racing instincts on high alert. Movement caught his eye across the stream. A shadow shifted between the trees, then another. Solano raised his head, water dripping from his muzzle as the shapes began to take form. Through the morning mist, he saw them. A herd of wild horses emerging from the forest, like spirits materializing from the shadows. Their appearance was nothing like the polished, well-groomed horses of the racing world. These were creatures of the wilderness, their manes untamed, their coats bearing the marks of free living. At their head stood a magnificent stallion, his dark coat gleaming with natural health, his muscles rippling with untamed power. The wild horses approached the stream cautiously, their movements synchronized with years of living together in the wilderness. The lead stallion's eyes fixed on Solano with an intensity that spoke of both authority and wariness. This was their territory, their watering place, and Solano was an intruder. The lead stallion pawed the ground, sending small stones scattering. The message was clear. This was a challenge. Solano's racing experience had taught him to read the subtle language of horses, but this was different. This wasn't the controlled environment of the track. This was raw, primitive communication. A younger stallion from the herd, his coat a rich chestnut color, stepped forward with the impetuousness of youth. His ears were pinned back, his posture aggressive. Before Solano could react, the young horse charged across the shallow stream, water spraying in his wake. The attack was swift and decisive, a powerful strike that sent Solano stumbling backward. The impact jarred through his body, aggravating his injured leg. Solano struggled to maintain his balance, his years of athletic training helping him stay upright. The wild horses watched him passively as he regained his footing, their judgment evident in their steady gaze. The message was clear. Weakness would not be tolerated in the wilderness. Pride warred with survival instinct as Solano backed away from the stream. The herd moved in to drink, effectively dismissing him. Their casual dismissal stung more than the physical blow. In his racing days, he had commanded respect with his mere presence. Now, he was nothing more than an unwelcome outsider. Yet as he retreated into the forest, something stirred within him. The sight of the herd had awakened a deep, primal longing. Their freedom, their unity, their natural strength. It called to something buried beneath years of human training. For the first time since his abandonment, Solano felt a glimmer of purpose. In the days that followed, he began to shadow the herd from a distance. His racing experience had given him the endurance to keep pace, even with his injury. He watched how they moved through the forest, studied their patterns of grazing and rest. Each observation was a lesson in survival, each day a step closer to understanding this new world. The herd was aware of his presence, but largely ignored him, treating him as they would any other forest creature that posed no immediate threat. The young stallion who had struck him occasionally tossed his head in warning if Solano strayed too close, but the outright hostility had faded into wary tolerance. Slowly, Solano began to notice changes in himself. His movements became more fluid, more attuned to the forest's rhythm. The remnants of his domestic life, the need for regular feeding times, the expectation of human care, began to fade. In their place grew something new, an awareness of the forest's natural cycles, an understanding of its unspoken laws. The forest had its own way of marking time, so different from the rigid schedules of the racing world. Solano's days were now measured by the rising and setting of the sun, by the movement of the herd, and by the gradual strengthening of his injured leg. Each dawn brought new challenges and lessons in survival. The wild horses had developed an unspoken routine in their territory. They moved between different grazing grounds, always alert for predators, always aware of the changing seasons. Solano learned to read the signs they followed, the subtle shifts in wind direction, the warning calls of birds, the freshness of grass in different clearings. One particularly challenging morning, the herd began a steep climb up a rocky slope. Solano, maintaining his usual distance, watched as they navigated the treacherous terrain with practiced ease. His injured leg trembled at the thought of such a climb, but something inside him refused to turn back. With careful determination, he began to follow their path. The ascent was grueling. Each step required precise placement, each movement a calculated risk. His racing years had taught him about pushing through pain, but this was different. This wasn't about speed or competition. It was about pure survival. The herd had already disappeared over the ridge, leaving him alone on the precarious slope. Halfway up, his injured leg slipped on loose shale. For a heart-stopping moment, he struggled to maintain his balance. The training that had once earned him trophies now served a different purpose as he fought to regain his footing. A shower of small stones clattered down the slope, the sound echoing through the valley below. To his surprise, he noticed movement at the top of the ridge. The lead stallion had reappeared, watching his struggle with inscrutable eyes. There was no offer of help, no sign of concern, just steady observation. Solano met his gaze, understanding that this was another test. With renewed determination, he continued his climb. When he finally reached the top, his legs were shaking with exhaustion, but he held his head high. The lead stallion remained there, his dark coat gleaming in the morning sun. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two creatures born of different worlds, connected by the primitive challenge of survival. Then, without warning, the wild horse turned and moved away, but his body language had shifted slightly. It was subtle, but the message was clear. Solano had earned a measure of respect. The plateau revealed why the herd made this difficult journey. Hidden from below was a lush meadow, sheltered by rocky outcrops and fed by a spring that bubbled up from the ground. The grass here was sweet and abundant, and the natural barriers provided protection from predators. It was a sanctuary that only those strong enough to reach it could enjoy. As the days passed, Solano was allowed to graze progressively closer to the herd. The young stallion, who had initially attacked him, still watched him warily, but the aggression had been replaced by a reluctant acceptance. The mares and foals began to take less notice of his presence, their initial tension easing into casual indifference. One afternoon, while the herd rested in the dappled shade of the forest, Solano observed their social interactions with growing fascination. A young foal practiced rearing and striking at the air, mimicking the defensive moves of the adults. Two mares groomed each other's necks, strengthening their social bonds. The lead stallion stood slightly apart, ever vigilant, occasionally communicating with soft, nickering sounds that Solano was learning to interpret. These moments revealed a complex social structure that went beyond mere survival. Each member of the herd had a role, a place in the hierarchy that was both rigid and fluid. Through their example, Solano began to understand that true strength wasn't just about physical power or speed. It was about adaptation, awareness, and connection to others. His own body was changing too. The refined muscles built for racing were being replaced by the hardier sinews needed for forest life. His coat, once meticulously groomed, had developed a rougher, more weather-resistant texture. Even his injured leg, though it would never fully heal, had found a new strength in the constant varied movement that forest life demanded. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Solano found himself standing closer to the herd than ever before. The lead stallion, making his evening rounds, passed by without the usual warning glance. It wasn't full acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning. In this moment, watching the herd settle for the night, Solano felt something he hadn't experienced since his racing days, a sense of belonging. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the forest as Solano followed the herd along a new trail. His ears caught the sound of rushing water growing louder with each step. The path ahead opened into a clearing where a river cut through the landscape, its waters swollen from recent rains. The herd approached the bank cautiously, testing the ground with practiced steps. The lead stallion surveyed the crossing point, his powerful frame silhouetted against the glistening water. The river was wider here, but a series of partially submerged rocks created a natural pathway across. The herd had clearly used this crossing before, but today the water levels made it more treacherous than usual. As the lead stallion guided the herd across, Solano watched their movements intently. Each horse picked their way carefully from rock to rock, the younger ones following closely behind their mothers. The sound of splashing water mixed with soft nickering as they communicated with each other, offering reassurance and guidance. Suddenly, a cry of distress cut through the air. One of the youngest foals, barely a few months old, had slipped from the crossing. The current, stronger than it appeared, began pulling the young horse downstream. The foal's mother whinnied in panic, but she was already halfway across with another young one by her side, unable to turn back against the current. Without hesitation, Solano sprang into action. His years of racing had given him an intimate understanding of movement and momentum. He quickly assessed the situation, noting how the current was flowing and where the foal was being swept. His injured leg protested as he moved swiftly along the bank, parallel to the struggling young horse. The foal's head bobbed above the water, its eyes wide with fear. Solano pushed through the pain in his leg, matching the current's speed. Ahead, he spotted a bend in the river where the water slowed slightly, creating a small eddy. It was their best chance. Calculating the distance and timing, skills honed through countless races, Solano plunged into the water at precisely the right moment. The cold shocked his system, but his focus never wavered. Swimming against the current, he positioned himself to intercept the foal's path. His injured leg made it difficult to maintain a straight course, but years of compensating for the weakness had taught him how to adjust. As the foal approached, Solano maneuvered himself to create a barrier between the young horse and the strongest part of the current. The foal instinctively pressed against him, finding stability in his larger frame. Together, they fought against the water's pull, gradually making their way toward the slower-moving eddy. The herd had gathered at the river's edge, watching intently. The lead stallion stood at the forefront, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by focused attention. As Solano guided the foal closer to the bank, several members of the herd moved into position to help. When they finally reached the shore, the foal's mother rushed forward, checking her offspring for any injuries. Exhausted, Solano pulled himself from the water, his injured leg trembling from the exertion. Water streamed from his coat as he stood there, catching his breath. The lead stallion approached slowly, his presence commanding attention from the entire herd. For a long moment, he studied Solano with those penetrating eyes that had once held only suspicion. Then, in a gesture that carried immense significance in the horse world, the lead stallion lowered his head slightly and stepped to the side, creating space for Solano to join the main group. It wasn't an elaborate ceremony or a dramatic declaration. Wild horses didn't need those. It was a simple acknowledgement, but its meaning was profound. The rest of the herd's behavior shifted almost immediately. The protective circle that had always kept Solano at a distance began to dissolve. The young stallion who had once attacked him now stood nearby without hostility. The foal's mother gave a soft nicker of gratitude, a sound that seemed to ripple through the group. As they continued their journey, Solano found himself walking among them rather than following behind. His position wasn't at the front where the lead stallion guided the herd, nor was it at the back where the younger males usually stayed. Instead, he settled into a spot in the middle where the mares and foals traveled. It was a place of trust, earned not through displays of dominance or speed, but through demonstrating a different kind of strength. The transformation in Solano's status within the herd brought with it new challenges and responsibilities. As the seasons began to change, bringing cooler winds and shorter days, he found himself taking on roles he never could have imagined during his racing days. The herd's acceptance wasn't just a privilege, it was a commitment to contribute to their collective survival. His position among the mares and foals wasn't random, he discovered. His experience with human training had given him a unique perspective on movement and balance, skills that proved valuable in teaching the younger horses. The foal he had rescued from the river now sought him out regularly, mimicking his careful way of navigating difficult terrain. One crisp morning, while the herd grazed in a meadow bordered by dense forest, Solano noticed something that his racing-trained senses had picked up. A slight change in the wind brought unfamiliar scents, and the birds in the nearby trees had gone quiet. His ears swiveled, catching sounds that seemed out of place in the peaceful morning. The lead stallion had noticed too, his head raised high, nostrils flaring. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of unspoken understanding passing between them. Without any obvious signal, Solano began quietly moving among the grazing horses, particularly near the younger ones, his presence a subtle warning to stay alert. His years of reading the subtle cues of jockeys and trainers had taught him the value of quiet communication. Now, those skills found new purpose as he helped coordinate the herd's movements. When danger threatened, every member needed to move as one, and Solano's position in the middle of the group helped relay signals from the lead stallion to the others. The young stallion who had once been his adversary now worked alongside him, their former rivalry transformed into a partnership of necessity. Together, they developed a system of watching the herd's flanks, their different backgrounds complementing each other. The young stallion's natural instincts combined with Solano's trained precision created a more effective defense than either could achieve alone. During one particularly challenging migration to winter grazing grounds, Solano's experience with pacing proved invaluable. The journey was long and arduous, with limited opportunities for rest and grazing. The lead stallion set the overall direction, but Solano helped maintain a sustainable pace, especially for the younger members of the herd. His understanding of conserving energy, learned through years of competitive racing, now served to protect the herd's most vulnerable members. As they traveled, Solano found himself naturally falling into the role of mentor to the younger horses. His methodical approach to crossing difficult terrain, born from adapting to his injured leg, provided a valuable example. The foals learned to pick their way carefully through rocky areas, to test uncertain ground before committing their full weight, to use their bodies efficiently rather than relying solely on speed and strength. The mares, initially cautious of his presence near their young, began to accept and even welcome his influence. They recognized that his different background brought valuable skills to the herd. During rest periods, he would often find himself surrounded by curious foals, their playful energy reminding him of his own early days of training, though in a vastly different context. His injured leg, once a mark of shame that had led to his abandonment, became a source of unexpected wisdom. The young horses learned from watching how he adapted, how he compensated for the weakness without letting it limit him. In a world where survival depended on overcoming challenges, this was a crucial lesson. The lead stallion observed these developments with quiet approval. Though he remained the unquestioned leader of the herd, he recognized the value of having a lieutenant who brought different strengths to the group. During their watches, the two would often stand together, each scanning the horizon from their unique perspectives, the wild horse's innate understanding of the forest melding with Solano's trained alertness. One evening, as the herd settled for the night in a sheltered valley, Solano stood at the edge of the group, his attention focused on the deepening shadows of the forest. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and a cool breeze carried the sense of the approaching night. His ears moved constantly, catching every sound, while his body remained perfectly still, a stance that blended his racing discipline with wild instinct. The changing seasons had brought new challenges to the herd. The air grew colder, and the once abundant grass became scarcer. Solano noticed how the led stallion's behavior had become more focused on finding sustainable feeding grounds, their daily movements covering greater distances than before. The entire herd seemed to sense the approaching changes, an instinctive understanding that harder times lay ahead. His racing experiences had taught him about preparation and timing, lessons that found new meaning in the wild. While the other horses grazed, Solano would study the landscape, noting which areas still held the greenest grass, where the ground remained soft enough for the foal's hooves, which paths offered the best protection from the strengthening winds. One morning, as dawn broke over the forest, Solano detected a change in the air. His nostrils flared, catching unfamiliar scents carried on the wind. The sky held an unusual color, and the forest had grown unnaturally quiet. These subtle signs triggered memories of his time in the stables, when handlers would rush to secure the horses before severe weather struck. The lead stallion also sensed the approaching storm, his powerful frame tense with alertness. The two horses exchanged glances, their shared concern evident. The herd's current position, while good for grazing, left them exposed to the elements. They needed to find shelter, and quickly. Solano's mind raced through his mental map of the territory. During their previous wanderings, he had noticed a formation of rocky outcrops that could provide protection. It wasn't far, but reaching it would require crossing an open stretch of land. The lead stallion seemed to read his thoughts, and with a subtle nod, granted him permission to help guide the herd. As they began to move, Solano took up his position among the mares and foals. His presence helped keep the younger ones calm as the wind began to pick up strength. The sky darkened ominously above them, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The lead stallion set a brisk pace, but Solano helped ensure it wasn't too fast for the weaker members of the herd. The rain intensified, drumming against the ground with increasing force. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by rolling thunder that made the younger horses nervous. Solano moved closer to them, his calm demeanor providing reassurance. His years of maintaining composure during chaotic race starts now served to steady the frightened foals. The rocky shelter was within sight when the storm hit with full force. Wind howled through the trees, bending branches and sending leaves swirling through the air. The rain became a blinding sheet, making it difficult to see more than a few lengths ahead. Solano's injured leg ached with the dampness, but he pushed through the discomfort, focusing on keeping the herd together. Using his body as a guide, he helped direct the mares and their foals toward the natural corridor between the rocks. The formation created a series of small caves and overhangs, offering protection from both wind and rain. The lead stallion took up position at the entrance, while Solano worked to organize the herd within the shelter. As the storm raged outside, the herd huddled together in the rocky enclosure. The young stallion, who had once been Solano's rival, now stood beside him at the secondary entrance, both of them alert for any signs of danger. The foals pressed close to their mothers, while the older horses formed a protective circle around them. In this moment of crisis, Solano realized how completely his life had transformed. The precision and discipline of his racing days had found new purpose in protecting and guiding the herd. His injured leg, once a symbol of his downfall, had taught him patience and adaptability, qualities that now helped him serve his new family. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered in the forest. Fallen branches littered the ground, streams had swollen beyond their banks, and familiar paths had been altered by the force of wind and rain. The herd emerged from their rocky shelter into a landscape transformed, requiring new strategies for survival. Solano's keen observation skills, honed through years of reading race conditions, proved invaluable as they navigated the changed terrain. He helped identify safe crossing points where flooding had made their usual routes impassable, and his careful steps showed the younger horses how to traverse ground made treacherous by mud and debris. The lead stallion relied increasingly on Solano's judgment, especially when it came to protecting the more vulnerable members of the herd. Their silent communication had evolved into a partnership that strengthened the entire group. The other horses had come to recognize Solano's signals as readily as they did their leaders, creating a more robust system of protection. One evening, as the herd grazed in a clearing still damp from the recent storms, Solano noticed something that set his racing instincts on edge. The birds had gone quiet, but not in the usual way that preceded a storm. This silence was different, more urgent. His nostrils flared, catching an unfamiliar scent on the breeze. The lead stallion had sensed it too, his powerful frame tensing as he scanned the forest's edge. The younger horses, picking up on the leader's concern, began to bunch together instinctively. The mares moved closer to their foals, while the young stallion took up a defensive position on the herd's flank. Then they heard it, a low growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Wolves had entered their territory, drawn perhaps by the disruption of their usual hunting grounds after the storm. The predators emerged from the shadows, their lean forms moving with practiced coordination. This wasn't a random encounter, it was a planned hunt. Solano's racing experience had taught him to read movement and anticipate strategies. He could see how the wolves were trying to separate the weaker members from the group, using the gathering darkness to their advantage. The lead stallion maintained his position at the front of the herd, while Solano began quietly organizing the others into a defensive formation he had learned from watching their previous encounters with threats. The young stallion, following Solano's lead, helped guide the mares and foals into a tight circle. Their positioning wasn't random. Solano had placed the strongest horses on the outer edge, while ensuring the foals had clear paths to the center if they needed to retreat quickly. His injured leg meant he couldn't move as swiftly as before, but his strategic thinking more than compensated for this limitation. As the wolves began to circle closer, the herd moved as one unit, maintaining their formation while slowly backing toward denser forest cover. Solano had noted earlier how the fallen branches from the storm had created natural barriers in certain areas. Now, He helped guide the herd toward one of these locations, using the debris to protect their flanks and limit the directions from which the wolves could approach. The lead stallion, recognizing Solano's strategy, worked in perfect synchronization with him. When one wolf darted forward to test the herd's defenses, both horses reacted in tandem. The lead stallion's powerful charge combined with Solano's positioning to drive the predator back without leaving any gaps in their defense. The younger horses, who had learned from Solano's example over the past months, maintained their composure even as the tension mounted. They held their positions, neither panicking nor breaking formation, their trust in their leaders evident in their disciplined response to the threat. The standoff with the wolves continued as darkness crept through the forest. Solano maintained his position, every muscle tense with alertness. The predators had grown bolder with hunger, their attacks becoming more frequent and daring. The herd's defensive formation, though effective, was being tested to its limits. A particularly aggressive wolf made a sudden lunge toward one of the younger foals who had strayed slightly from the protective circle. Without hesitation, Solano moved to intercept, placing his body between the predator and its intended target. His injured leg protested at the quick movement, but years of racing had taught him to push through pain when stakes were high. The lead stallion took advantage of this moment to organize a strategic retreat. The herd began moving as one unit, maintaining their tight formation while following the path Solano had identified earlier. The fallen trees and dense undergrowth provided natural barriers, forcing the wolves to attack from predictable directions. Through the darkness, Solano could make out a familiar rock formation in the distance. He remembered discovering it during his early days of following the herd, a natural fortress with high walls and a narrow entrance. If they could reach it, the wolves would be forced to attack from a single direction, giving the herd a significant tactical advantage. Using the subtle communication system they had developed, Solano conveyed his plan to the lead stallion. The wild horse's trust in his judgment had grown strong enough that he immediately understood and adjusted their course. The younger stallion, picking up on their silent exchange, helped guide the mares and foals toward their destination. The wolves, sensing their prey might escape, intensified their attacks. Two of them darted in simultaneously from different angles, trying to break the herd's formation. Solano's racing experience came into play as he anticipated their movements, positioning himself to counter their strategy. His ability to read and react to multiple opponents, honed through years of competitive racing, proved invaluable in this life-or-death situation. Rain began to fall again, making the ground treacherous. The herd's progress slowed as they carefully picked their way through the challenging terrain. Solano's intimate knowledge of dealing with difficult conditions helped him guide the others, showing them how to maintain their footing on the slippery ground while keeping their defensive formation intact. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, revealing they were nearly at their destination. The rocky shelter loomed ahead, its walls promising safety, but the final approach would be the most dangerous. They would need to pass through a narrow gap between two fallen trees, temporarily breaking their tight formation. The lead stallion took charge of the front, while Solano positioned himself to guard their flanks during the crucial transition. The young stallion, who had once been his rival, now worked seamlessly with him, understanding the importance of their coordination. One by one, the mares and foals began moving through the gap. A wolf, seizing what it thought was an opportunity, lunged toward the group. Solano reacted instantly, using his body to block the attack. His injured leg buckled slightly from the impact, but he remained standing, his determination unwavering. The lead stallion quickly moved to support him, and together they created an impenetrable barrier. The last of the foals made it through the gap, followed by the remaining mares. The young stallion guided them into the rocky shelter, while Solano and the lead stallion maintained their defensive position. The wolves, realizing their opportunity was slipping away, launched one final desperate attack. In this crucial moment, all of Solano's past experiences came together. The discipline of his racing days, the adaptability learned from his injury, the survival skills gained in the wild, and the trust built with his new family. Standing alongside the lead stallion, he faced the threat not as a former racing champion, not as an outcast, but as a vital member of the herd. The rocky shelter proved to be their salvation. Once inside, the herd quickly organized themselves into a defensive position that Solano and the lead stallion had perfected over their months together. The narrow entrance meant the wolves could only approach one at a time, negating their advantage of numbers. Through the night, the predators tested their defenses repeatedly, but each time they were met with the unified strength of the herd. The young stallion had taken position beside Solano, their former rivalry completely transformed into a partnership based on mutual respect and trust. Together, they helped maintain the herd's courage as the long hours of darkness wore on. As dawn approached, the wolves' attacks became less frequent. The first rays of sunlight revealed tracks in the mud, showing the predators had finally retreated. The herd had survived the night not through speed or pure strength, but through strategy, unity, and the unique combination of skills that each member brought to the group. The lead stallion surveyed the herd, checking for any injuries. His gaze lingered on Solano, who stood tired but proud at his post. The night's events had proven beyond any doubt that Solano's different background wasn't a weakness. It was a strength that had helped ensure their survival. His racing experience had given him the discipline and strategic thinking that complemented the wild horse's natural instincts. As the morning progressed, the herd began to relax. The younger horses, resilient as only the young can be, started to play among themselves, their spirits quickly recovering from the night's ordeal. Solano watched them with quiet satisfaction, remembering his own journey from a frightened, abandoned racehorse to a trusted member of this wild family. The landscape around them still bore the marks of the recent storms: fallen trees, muddy ground, and swollen streams. But these challenges no longer seemed as daunting as they once had. The herd had grown stronger through each trial they faced together, learning to combine their different strengths and adapt to whatever nature threw at them. Solano's injured leg, though stiff from the night's exertion, no longer defined him. What had once been seen as a career-ending weakness had become part of a larger story of adaptation and survival. The very limitations it imposed had forced him to develop other strengths: patience, strategy, and a deep understanding of how to work with others. The lead stallion approached Solano as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Their silent communication had evolved into something profound, a partnership that transcended their different origins. With a gentle touch of his muzzle to Solano's neck, the lead stallion acknowledged what the entire herd now knew. Solano wasn't just an accepted member of their family, he had become indispensable. The young stallion who had once challenged him now stood guard nearby, demonstrating how completely the dynamics within the herd had changed. The foals played close to Solano, no longer seeing him as an outsider, but as a protector and teacher. The mares grazed peacefully, their trust in his presence absolute. Looking out over the forest from their elevated position, Solano could see the vast wilderness that had once seemed so hostile and foreign. Now it was home, every tree and stream familiar, every change in the wind carrying meaning. His racing days felt like a distant memory, not forgotten, but transformed into something new and equally meaningful. The herd began to move out from their shelter, ready to face whatever new challenges awaited them. Solano took his place among them, his movements sure despite his old injury. The morning sun caught his coat, no longer the gleaming perfection of a racehorse, but the hardy, weathered appearance of a wild horse who had found his true purpose. The seasons had completed their cycle since Solano's abandonment in the forest. The spring air carried the scent of new beginnings, and the forest was alive with the sounds of renewal. The herd moved through their territory with the confident ease of a family that had weathered countless challenges together. Solano's position within the group had evolved into something unique, not quite a leader in the traditional sense, but a guardian whose wisdom and experience had become essential to their survival. His racing past, once a source of pride and then of shame, had transformed into a foundation of skills that served a greater purpose. One morning, as the herd grazed in a sun-dappled meadow, Solano's keen ears caught a familiar sound that he hadn't heard in many months, the distant rumble of a vehicle on the forest road. The memory of his abandonment flickered through his mind, but it no longer carried the sting of betrayal. Instead, he felt a surge of gratitude for the path that had led him here. The lead stallion noticed his attention and moved closer, their shoulders almost touching. The gesture spoke volumes about how far they had come, from suspicious adversaries to trusted partners in ensuring the herd's survival. Together, they watched as the sound faded away, leaving only the peaceful sounds of the forest. A group of foals played nearby, including some born during the past year who had never known Solano as anything but a permanent part of their family. They had grown up learning from his example, how to move efficiently despite limitations, how to read the subtle signs of approaching weather, how to work together in the face of challenges. The young stallion, who had once been his rival, now often sought his guidance, particularly in teaching the younger horses. Together, they had developed a training system that combined the wild horse's natural instincts with the disciplined approach Solano had learned in his racing days. The result was a stronger, more adaptable herd. As the sun climbed higher, Solano observed the family he had become part of. The mares grazed peacefully while keeping watchful eyes on their young. The adolescent horses practiced their defensive moves, their movements showing a blend of wild energy and practiced precision. The lead stallion stood guard, his powerful presence ensuring their safety. His injured leg, though it would never fully heal, had become a testament to resilience rather than a mark of failure. The very adaptation it had forced had made him a better teacher, showing the younger horses that strength came in many forms. They learned that speed wasn't always the answer, that strategy and teamwork often proved more valuable than raw power. The forest that had once seemed like a place of exile had become a kingdom of endless discovery. Every change in the weather, every seasonal shift, every new challenge brought opportunities to grow and adapt. The herd's territory was vast, but they moved through it with the confidence of those who understood its rhythms and respected its laws. In quiet moments like these, Solano sometimes remembered the roar of the crowd, the thundering of hooves on the racetrack, the gleaming trophies and victory celebrations. But those memories no longer filled him with longing. His racing years had been a chapter in his story, but not the whole book. Here, among the wild horses who had become his family, he had found something far more valuable than any prize. He had found his true purpose. As the day drew to a close, the herd began their evening migration to the sheltered valley where they often spent their nights. Solano took his customary position, helping to guide the younger ones while keeping watch for any signs of danger. His movements were sure and purposeful, every step a testament to the remarkable journey that had brought him here. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, its light filtering through the trees to create dancing shadows on the forest floor. Solano moved with his family through this familiar landscape, his heart full with the knowledge that he had found not just survival, but true belonging. He was no longer the abandoned racehorse, nor merely a wild horse. He was both and neither, something uniquely his own. Dear listeners, we hope Solano's journey from abandoned champion to cherished protector has touched your hearts. His story reminds us that our greatest setbacks can lead to unexpected blessings, and that true strength often comes in forms we never imagined. To continue experiencing more captivating stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. You'll find the button right below this video. If Solano's tale moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and give us a like. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's transformative moments. Don't miss our upcoming content. There are many more inspiring journeys waiting to be shared. Join our community of storytellers and story lovers. We'll see you in the comments.